The dress was supposed to change everything, but instead it hung on Maeve Fitzgerald's frame like a shroud, as she stood alone at the altar of the small wooden church in Vulture City, Arizona Territory, watching the last traces of hope drain from the minister's weathered face. The pews behind her were empty save for 3 curious townswomen who had come to witness what was supposed to be her salvation. And the silence was so thick she could hear the desert wind rattling against the windows like skeletal fingers demanding entry. It was the spring of 1882, and she had traveled over 2,000 miles from Boston to marry a man she had never met, a rancher named Gerald Patterson, who had promised her a home and a future in his carefully worded letters. But Gerald Patterson was nowhere to be found. Maeve's hands trembled as she clutched the small bouquet of desert wildflowers the hotel keeper's wife had hastily assembled that morning. Her dark auburn hair had been pinned up with painstaking care, and the borrowed white dress, though too loose in the bodice and too short at the hem, was the finest thing she had worn since her father's funeral 3 years prior. She had imagined this moment so differently during the long train journey west, picturing a nervous but kind man waiting for her, someone who would offer her the stability her life had lacked since consumption took her parents and left her working 16-hour days in a textile mill, just to afford a cramped room in a boarding house where rats outnumbered residents. "Miss Fitzgerald," the minister said quietly, his voice carrying the gentle weight of a man who had delivered too much bad news in his career. "Perhaps we should accept that Mr. Patterson is not coming." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of humiliation through her chest. One of the women in the pews whispered something to her companion, and though Maeve could not hear the words, she heard the tone well enough. Pity mixed with schadenfreude, the particular cocktail that people seem to reserve for the misfortunes of strangers. "I received his last letter only 2 weeks ago," Maeve said, hating how her voice cracked on the words. "He confirmed the date. He sent money for the train fare." The minister nodded sympathetically. "These things happen, I am afraid. Men get cold feet or they find themselves in circumstances that prevent them from honoring their commitments. I am truly sorry." Maeve wanted to scream that sorry would not put a roof over her head or food in her belly. Sorry would not erase the fact that she had given up her job and her room, had burned every bridge in Boston to come here. She had exactly $7.32 to her name, and the hotel where she had stayed the previous night cost 50 cents a day. The arithmetic of her situation was brutally simple and utterly devastating. "What should I do?" she asked, the question escaping before pride could stop it. The minister opened his mouth to respond, but the church door swung open with enough force to make all of them turn. A man stood silhouetted in the bright afternoon sunlight, tall and lean with broad shoulders and dust covering his dark trousers and blue work shirt. He removed his hat as he stepped inside, revealing sandy brown hair that looked as though it had been hastily combed with fingers, and his eyes, a striking shade of gray-green, swept across the scene with quick intelligence. "Beg your pardon, Reverend," the man said, his voice a low baritone with the slight drawl of someone who had spent years under the western sun. "I heard there was supposed to be a wedding today." "There was supposed to be," the minister replied with evident frustration, "but the groom has failed to appear. Quincy, this is not the time for social calls, Quincy." The name registered in Maeve's mind along with his appearance. Somewhere in his late 20s, she guessed, with a face that was more interesting than handsome, all strong lines and weathered skin with a small scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He looked like the kind of man who worked with his hands and did not waste words, and there was something in his bearing that suggested capability and purpose. I know Gerald Patterson, Quincy said, and Maeve's attention snapped fully to him. Saw him last night at the Silver Dollar Saloon. He was pretty deep in his cups, talking loud about how he had changed his mind about marriage, how he liked his freedom too much to give it up for some woman he had never met. The words hit Maeve like a physical blow. It was one thing to be abandoned. It was another to know it had been deliberate, casual even, decided over whiskey while she had been carefully pressing her dress and rehearsing her vows in her hotel room. That coward, the minister muttered. Worse than a coward, Quincy said, his gaze moving to Maeve and staying there. A liar who brought a woman all the way out here under false pretenses. Maeve forced herself to meet his eyes, though shame burned in her cheeks. Did he say anything else? Quincy's expression softened slightly. Nothing worth repeating, madam. Just the talk of a fool trying to impress other fools. I am sorry you came all this way for nothing. It is not nothing, one of the women in the pews called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. It is a scandal. Imagine, a woman traveling alone to marry a stranger. I told Martha it was unseemly. Maeve turned to face the woman, and something inside her that had been compressed by years of poverty and powerlessness suddenly expanded. Imagine, a woman trying to survive in a world that pays her half what it pays a man for the same work. Imagine being so desperate for safety that you would cross a continent to find it. Yes, how unseemly of me to want to eat regularly and sleep without fear. The woman's face reddened, but before she could respond, Quincy spoke again. This is not entertainment. You ladies can leave now. There was no threat in his voice, but there was authority, and to Maeve's surprise, the three women gathered their skirts and departed with only minimal grumbling. The church felt larger with just the three of them and somehow more intimate. Miss Fitzgerald, the minister began, but Quincy interrupted. How much money do you have? He asked Maeve directly. The bluntness of the question should have offended her, but there was no judgment in it, only practical concern. Enough for about 2 weeks at the hotel if I eat sparingly. And then I do not know, she admitted. I could try to find work, but I do not know what kind of work there is here for a woman, or how long it would take to save enough for train fare back east, or if I even have anything to go back to. Quincy nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. He turned to the minister. You still have the license for today's wedding, the minister blinked. Well, yes, but there is no groom. You are looking at one, Quincy said. The words hung in the air for a long moment while Maeve tried to process what he had just suggested. The minister looked equally stunned. Quincy York, have you lost your mind? The minister demanded. You cannot just marry a complete stranger. Why not? That is what she came here to do anyway. Quincy looked at Maeve again. I own a ranch about 8 miles outside town. It is not much, just a small cattle operation with a decent house and a barn. I could use help with the domestic side of things, and you need a home and security. Seems like a fair trade. Maeve's thoughts raced. This was insane. She knew nothing about this man except his name, and that he apparently had more honor than Gerald Patterson, which was an admittedly low bar. But what were her alternatives? Return to Boston in disgrace, assuming she could even afford the journey. Try to survive in a frontier town where she knew no one and had no prospects. She had already taken an enormous leap of faith by coming here. Perhaps this was simply another leap, equally necessary. Why would you do this? She asked. You do not know me. True enough, Quincy acknowledged. But I know something about being alone when you do not want to be. My parents died 6 years back. Fever took them both within a week of each other. I have been running the ranch by myself since then, and I am tired of coming home to an empty house. I am not expecting love or romance, just companionship and partnership, someone to build a life with. There was a rawness in his honesty that touched something in Maeve's chest. He was not offering her a fairy tale, just survival dressed up as marriage. And yet, there was something appealing in his straightforwardness, in the absence of pretty lies. "This is highly irregular," the minister protested. "Marriage is a sacred institution, not a business arrangement." "Most marriages are business arrangements," Quincy said. "At least we are being honest about it." The minister looked to Maeve. "Is this truly what you want, child? Was it?" She examined her feelings and found them complicated. She was frightened, certainly, but she had been frightened for years. She was angry at Gerald Patterson and at the circumstances that had brought her to this moment. But underneath those emotions was something else, a tiny spark of possibility. Quincy York seemed like a decent man, and decency was rarer than gold in her experience. He was offering her a chance, and chances were precious. "I want to not be destitute," Maeve said carefully. "I want a home where I am not at the mercy of a landlord or an employer. If Mr. York is truly willing to offer that, then yes, I am willing to accept." Quincy smiled then, just a small quirk of his lips, but it transformed his face entirely. "Quincy, just Quincy, I am not much for formality." "Maeve," she replied, "and I should warn you, I know nothing about ranching or living in the desert. I am a city girl born and raised." "I figured as much from the dress," he said, not unkindly. "But you can learn. Question is, are you willing to?" "I am willing to try." The minister sighed heavily and retrieved the marriage license from his desk. "Very well. But I am doing this under protest, and I expect both of you to take these vows seriously. Marriage is for life, no matter how unusual the beginning." "Understood," Quincy said. Maeve nodded her agreement, and just like that, the die was cast. The minister instructed them to stand together before the altar, and Maeve found herself beside this stranger who was about to become her husband. Quincy smelled of leather and sage and honest sweat, and when he took her hand for the ceremony, his palm was calloused and warm. The minister rushed through the service with the air of a man trying to outrun his own doubts. Maeve barely heard the words, too focused on the surreal reality of what was happening. When prompted, she repeated her vows in a voice that sounded steadier than she felt, and Quincy did the same, his gray-green eyes never leaving her face. "You have a ring?" the minister asked. Quincy shook his head. "Did not exactly plan this." "Neither did I," Maeve said, and to her surprise, she felt a bubble of laughter trying to escape. The absurdity of the entire situation was suddenly overwhelming. She had come here to marry a man who did not show up, and instead was marrying a different man who had walked through the door like something out of a dime novel. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said, sounding resigned. "You may kiss the bride, though I suppose that is optional given the circumstances." Quincy looked at Maeve, a question in his expression. She understood instinctively what he was asking: permission, boundaries, comfort. She appreciated that more than he could know. "A kiss on the cheek would be appropriate," she suggested. He leaned in and pressed his lips briefly to her cheek, the brush of contact sending an unexpected warmth through her. His stubble was rough against her skin, but not unpleasantly so, and for just a moment she caught the full warmth of his body close to hers. "Mrs. York," he said softly, testing the name. "Mr. York," she replied, equally experimental. The minister made them both sign the license, and then it was official. Maeve Fitzgerald had ceased to exist, replaced by Maeve York, wife of a rancher she had met less than 30 minutes ago. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt oddly calm, as though she had been holding her breath for years and was finally able to exhale. "I have a wagon outside," Quincy said as they left the church. We can stop by the hotel to collect your things and then head to the ranch. Sun is already past its peak, and I would like to be home before full dark. I do not have much, Maeve admitted. One trunk with my clothes and a few personal items. That is all right, we will get you what you need. The wagon was a sturdy flat bed with 2 horses hitched to it, both of them looking as work-worn and reliable as their owner. Quincy helped Maeve up onto the bench seat with a hand under her elbow, and she arranged her skirts as best she could while he climbed up beside her. The hotel was only 2 streets away, and the ride took just minutes, but Maeve was intensely aware of Quincy's presence beside her, the easy way he handled the reins, the quiet competence that seemed to radiate from him. The hotel keeper, a portly man with impressive mutton chops, looked surprised when they entered together. "Miss Fitzgerald, I heard about the wedding. I am terribly sorry." "No need for sorrow," Quincy said before Maeve could respond. "We got married instead. She is Mrs. York now." The hotel keeper's eyebrows shot up nearly to his hairline. "Is that so? Well, congratulations then. Let me fetch your trunk." While they waited, Quincy counted out coins to settle Maeve's bill despite her protest that she could pay it herself. "You are my wife now," he said simply. "Your money is your money, and what is mine is yours too. We are partners in this." The trunk was brought down, and Quincy loaded it easily into the wagon bed. As they left Vulture City behind, heading south into the desert landscape, Maeve watched the small collection of buildings grow smaller in the distance. The afternoon sun was fierce, and she was grateful for the bonnet she wore, though it did little to combat the dry heat that felt so different from the humid summers of Boston. The land here was beautiful in a harsh way, all red rock and scrub brush and distant purple mountains. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels, and overhead a hawk circled on thermal currents. Everything felt vast and open in a way that was both exhilarating and slightly frightening. There was nowhere to hide out here, no crowds to disappear into. "Tell me about yourself," Quincy said after they had ridden in silence for a while. "Where did you grow up?" "Boston," Maeve said. "My father was a clerk, my mother took in sewing. We were not wealthy, but we were comfortable until the consumption came. After they died, I had to find work in the mills. The pay was terrible and the conditions worse, but it was all I could get without references or education beyond basic reading and arithmetic. Must have been hard. It was survival," she said. "I was not living, just existing. When I saw the advertisement for mail-order brides, it seemed like an escape, a chance for something better." "And instead you got this," Quincy said with a slight smile. "A stranger in a wagon heading toward a cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere." "Better than the alternative," Maeve said honestly. "At least you showed up." He laughed at that, a genuine sound of amusement. "Low bar I am clearing." "Surprisingly low," she agreed and found herself smiling. They talked more as the miles passed, trading stories and information. Quincy had been born in Colorado, moved to Arizona with his parents when he was 12. They had started the ranch with just 50 head of cattle, built it up slowly through hard work and careful management. When they died, Quincy had been 22 and suddenly responsible for everything. He had thought about selling, moving to a city, trying something else, but the land had gotten into his blood. "It is a hard life sometimes," he admitted. "The drought years are brutal, and the market for beef is unpredictable. But there is something about working with your hands, building something that is yours. I cannot imagine doing anything else now." Maeve found herself watching him as he spoke, noting the way his face became animated when he talked about the ranch, the obvious pride he took in his work. There was an authenticity to him that was refreshing after years of interacting with people who wore masks and played roles to survive. The ranch appeared as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was modest, as Quincy had said. A simple house made of wood and stone with a covered porch, a large barn, several outbuildings and corrals where cattle milled about. But it looked solid and well-maintained, and to Maeve's eyes, accustomed to cramped urban living, it looked like a small kingdom. "Home," Quincy said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. He helped her down from the wagon and carried her trunk to the house. The interior was clean but sparse, clearly the domain of a man living alone. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a fireplace on one wall and a simple wooden table with 4 chairs. There were 2 doors leading off the main room, which Quincy indicated were the bedroom and a small storage room. "I will move my things to the storage room," Quincy said. "You should have the bedroom." "That is not necessary," Maeve protested. "We are married." "In name," Quincy said gently. "I am not expecting anything else until and unless you want it. Take the bedroom. I will be fine on a cot in the storage room." The consideration in his offer made Maeve's throat tight. "Thank you." He nodded and began moving his belongings while Maeve explored her new home. The bedroom was small but sufficient, with a real bed frame and mattress, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. There was even a mirror on the wall, silvered with age but functional. She unpacked her trunk slowly, hanging her few dresses on pegs and placing her under things in the drawers. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, the reality of her situation finally settling in. She was married. To a stranger, in a place thousands of miles from everything she had ever known. And yet, as she heard Quincy moving around in the main room, starting a fire in the stove and setting out supplies for dinner, she did not feel as frightened as she probably should have. When she emerged from the bedroom, having changed out of the wedding dress and into a simple cotton day dress, she found Quincy attempting to prepare food with the frustrated concentration of a man not comfortable in the kitchen. "Let me," Maeve said, moving to his side. "Cooking I can do. My mother taught me well." He stepped back gratefully. "I can cook enough to stay alive, but it is not pretty. Usually just beans and bacon, maybe some eggs if the chickens are cooperating." Maeve surveyed the available supplies and set to work. The larder was better stocked than she had expected, with flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, coffee, and even some preserved vegetables in jars. Within an hour she had produced a meal of cornbread, fried salt pork, beans seasoned with onion and molasses, and coffee. It was simple fare, but it was prepared with care, and she felt a small surge of pride as she set the plates on the table. Quincy's face lit up when he tasted the food. "This is delicious. Best meal I have had in months." "It is just cornbread and beans," Maeve said, but she was pleased nonetheless. "It is real cooking," he insisted. "Not just fuel. There is a difference." They ate in companionable silence for a while, and then Quincy said, "I want you to know you can leave if this is not what you want. I will give you money for the train fare back east, and we can see about an annulment. I do not want you to feel trapped." Maeve considered his words carefully. "And if I stay, what kind of life would we have?" "An honest one," Quincy said. "I work hard, but I make enough to live comfortably. We would not be rich, but we would not go hungry either. I would expect you to help with the household and maybe the chickens and the garden if you are willing. In return, you would have a home and security and my respect. As for the rest, affection and such, I suppose we would see what develops. No pressure, no expectations, just 2 people trying to make a good life together." "That sounds remarkably reasonable," Maeve said. "I try to be a reasonable man," she smiled. "I am beginning to see that. All right then, I will stay. Let us see what develops." The relief on his face was subtle but unmistakable. "Good. I am glad." After dinner, Quincy showed her around the property in the fading light. The barn housed his 2 riding horses in addition to the wagon team, plus a milk cow and her calf. The chicken coop held a dozen hens who eyed Maeve with suspicious poultry glares. There was a large garden plot, currently empty except for a few struggling winter vegetables, which Quincy admitted he had neglected. "I am not much of a gardener," he said. "But if you have the knowledge and the inclination, the soil is decent when you water it enough." "I can do that," Maeve said, already mentally planning what she might plant. The stars were emerging by the time they returned to the house, and Maeve was struck by how many there were, how brilliant against the black sky. In Boston, smoke and city lights had obscured all but the brightest stars, but here they were countless, like diamonds scattered on velvet. "It is beautiful," she breathed. "It is," Quincy agreed, but when she glanced at him, he was looking at her, not the sky. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a spark of connection that made Maeve's breath catch. Then Quincy cleared his throat and looked away. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow will be a full day. I need to ride out and check on the herd, and you will probably want time to settle in properly." "That sounds good," Maeve said, though a small part of her was disappointed that the moment had ended. They said good night, and Maeve retreated to the bedroom. She changed into her nightgown and crawled into the bed, which was surprisingly comfortable. She could hear Quincy moving around in the other room, the sounds of him preparing for sleep, and then the house fell quiet. Maeve lay awake for a long time, processing the extraordinary day she had just lived through. This morning she had been a jilted bride, humiliated and hopeless. Now she was a married woman with a home and a husband who seemed kind and honorable. The speed of the transformation was dizzying. But as she finally drifted towards sleep, she realized she felt something she had not felt in years: hope. It was fragile and tentative, but it was real. Whatever happened next, she was not facing it alone. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Maeve with its comfort. She woke each morning to the sound of Quincy moving around, starting the fire and preparing for his day. She would rise and make breakfast, and they would eat together while discussing the day's plans. Then Quincy would head out to work the ranch, and Maeve would tackle the household tasks. She threw herself into making the house a home. She scrubbed every surface until it gleamed, organized the kitchen to her liking, and began sewing curtains for the windows from fabric Quincy brought her from town. The garden became her special project. She turned the soil, enriched it with manure from the barn, and planted seeds for vegetables and herbs. Each day she would water and tend the small shoots that emerged, feeling a disproportionate pride in their growth. Quincy, for his part, seemed to appreciate her efforts. He would come in dusty and tired each evening, and his face would soften when he saw what she had accomplished. He began bringing her small gifts from town: a packet of flower seeds, a new cast iron skillet, once a book of poetry that he said had made him think of her. "Why poetry?" she asked, touched by the gesture. "You seem like someone who would appreciate beauty in words," he said with a slight shrug, as though embarrassed by the sentiment. She read the poems aloud sometimes in the evenings, while Quincy mended tack or carved new fence posts. He would listen quietly, his hands never stopping their work, but she could tell he was paying attention by the way he sometimes smiled at a particular phrase or image. They talked more as the days passed, the conversations growing deeper and more personal. Maeve learned that Quincy had wanted to be a teacher when he was young, that he loved books and learning but had set those dreams aside when his parents died. He learned that she had once sung in a church choir and missed music, that she had a gift for mathematics that had never been put to any use beyond calculating her wages. "You could keep the ranch books," Quincy suggested one evening. I am terrible at it, and I would trust your judgment." "I would like that," Maeve said, pleased to be given responsibility and trust. She took over the accounting and discovered that Quincy had been undercharging some of his customers and overpaying for supplies. Within a month, she had reorganized his business affairs to be more profitable, and he was openly impressed. "You have a head for this," he said, reviewing her neat ledgers. "We are going to do well together." The word together sent a warm flutter through her chest. They were becoming a team, a partnership, exactly as he had promised. But Maeve was increasingly aware that her feelings were evolving beyond partnership. She found herself watching Quincy when he did not know she was looking, admiring the strength in his hands, the line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She thought about what it would be like if he kissed her on the lips instead of the chaste pecks on the forehead he sometimes gave her in greeting or farewell. She wondered if he felt the same, or if she was still just a convenient arrangement to him. He was always respectful, always kind, but careful never to cross the invisible line they had established on their wedding day. Sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, but he always glanced away before she could interpret it. One evening about 2 months into their marriage, a storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing rain and lightning and thunder that shook the house. Maeve had never experienced a desert storm before, and the violence of it was both terrifying and exhilarating. She stood on the porch watching the rain come down in sheets, the lightning turning the landscape bright as day for split seconds. Quincy came up beside her, having finished securing the animals in the barn. "You should come inside. Lightning can be dangerous out here." "It is magnificent," Maeve said, unable to take her eyes from the display. "It is," he agreed, but again she felt his gaze on her rather than the storm. She turned to look at him, and the intensity in his eyes took her breath away. The air between them felt charged, electric as the lightning. She saw him struggle with something internal, saw the moment he decided to speak. "Maeve, I need to tell you something." "What is it?" "This arrangement, this marriage, it is not just convenience for me anymore." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I have come to care for you. Deeply. And I find myself wanting things I told myself I would not expect." Her heart hammered in her chest. "What things?" "A real marriage," he said quietly. "Not just companionship, but affection. Partnership, yes, but also love, if that is something you could ever want with me." Maeve felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "I have been hoping you would say something like that. I thought I was alone in feeling this way." "You are not alone," Quincy said, and there was such relief in his voice. "You have not been alone for a while now." He reached out and cupped her face gently in his rough hands, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. "Can I kiss you? Really kiss you?" "Yes," she breathed, and then his lips were on hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though he was still afraid of frightening her or overstepping. But Maeve responded eagerly, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and the kiss deepened. It was nothing like the brief peck at their wedding. This was real and passionate, full of weeks of suppressed longing and growing affection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," Quincy admitted. "I wish you had," Maeve said, and kissed him again. The storm raged around them, but they barely noticed, too caught up in their own discovery of each other. When the rain began to blow onto the porch, they moved inside, and Quincy pulled her close, just holding her against his chest. "I know this started strangely," he said into her hair, "but I want you to know I am committed to making you happy, to building a real life with you." "You already have," Maeve said. "This is already more than I ever hoped for." That night, for the first time, they shared the bedroom. It felt natural and right, the physical consummation of feelings that had been growing steadily. Quincy was tender and patient, mindful that this was new to Maeve, and she was grateful for his care. Afterward, lying in his arms, she felt a completeness she had not known she was missing. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. She felt him smile against her hair. "I love you too. I think I have for a while now." From that night forward, their relationship transformed into something neither had quite expected when they had stood at that altar. They were not just partners but lovers, not just companions but deeply connected souls. The physical distance they had maintained collapsed entirely, and they reveled in the simple intimacy of sharing a bed, of waking together, of stolen kisses throughout the day. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Maeve's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables that improved their diet considerably. She began keeping chickens more seriously, increasing the flock and selling eggs in town for extra income. Quincy, freed from worrying about the household details, was able to focus on the herd, and he made some shrewd purchases of young cattle that he raised and sold at profit. They talked about the future often now, making plans together. Quincy wanted to expand the ranch, maybe buy the neighboring property if it ever came up for sale. Maeve wanted to get more education, maybe through correspondence courses. They both wanted children, though they agreed to wait a year or so to get more established first. Maeve made friends in town, other ranch wives who welcomed her into their circle. She joined a ladies' aid society at the church, which met monthly to work on charitable projects. The same minister who had married them seemed pleased to see that their unusual union had developed into something real and strong. One day in early autumn, nearly 6 months after their wedding, Quincy came home with news. "Gerald Patterson is leaving town," he announced. "Got run out of the Silver Dollar for cheating at cards. He is heading to California, supposedly." Maeve felt only the faintest stirring of interest at the name that had once represented her future. "I hope he finds whatever he is looking for." "You ever regret it?" Quincy asked. "The way things happened." "Not for a single moment," Maeve said truthfully. "If he had shown up that day, I would have married him and been miserable. Instead, I got you and I got this life. I am grateful for his cowardice." Quincy pulled her into his arms. "Best thing he ever did for me was stand you up." As autumn deepened into winter, Maeve realized she had not had her monthly courses in some time. The realization filled her with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. When she told Quincy, he picked her up and spun her around, his joy uncomplicated and obvious. "A baby," he kept saying, as though trying to make the concept real. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Maeve asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not begin to cover it," he said. "Maeve, you have given me everything I did not know I needed, and now this." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Maeve felt well most of the time, and she continued her work around the ranch with only minor modifications. Quincy became almost comically protective, insisting she not lift anything heavy and worrying if she so much as sneezed. She found his concern endearing, even when it was excessive. They spent the long winter evenings preparing for the baby, turning the storage room where Quincy had briefly slept into a nursery. Maeve sewed tiny garments and blankets while Quincy built a cradle, sanding it until the wood was smooth as silk. They argued good-naturedly about names, each proposing increasingly ridiculous options to make the other laugh, when spring arrived again, marking a full year since Maeve had arrived in Vulture City. She was hugely pregnant and eagerly awaiting their child. The anniversary of their strange wedding fell on a beautiful April day, and Quincy surprised her by recreating their wedding dinner as best he could. "You cooked?" Maeve asked, astonished and touched. "I tried," he said sheepishly. "It is not as good as when you make it, but I wanted to do something special. The food was indeed a bit rough, the cornbread slightly burned and the beans underseasoned, but Maeve ate every bite with genuine appreciation for the effort and the sentiment. After dinner, Quincy presented her with a small box. Inside was a simple gold ring. "I know we did not have rings at the wedding," he said, "but I wanted you to have one now, something to show the world you are mine and I am yours." Maeve slipped the ring onto her finger, her eyes bright with tears. "It is perfect." "You are perfect," Quincy said. "This whole year has been perfect, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts because we faced them together." "I love you so much," Maeve said, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you too. Always will." The baby came in late May, a long labor that left Maeve exhausted but exhilarated. The doctor who came from town pronounced her and the baby healthy, and Quincy was allowed into the room to meet his son. He held the tiny bundle with extreme care, his face a mixture of awe and terror. "He is so small," he whispered. "He will grow," Maeve said tiredly. "What should we name him?" They had settled on a name weeks ago, but Quincy said it now with official gravity. "Matthew York, after your father." Maeve's eyes filled with tears. She had mentioned once, months ago, that her father's name had been Matthew, and Quincy had remembered. "That is perfect." Young Matthew proved to be a good baby, fussy only when hungry or wet. Quincy was a devoted father from the start, rising in the night to bring the baby to Maeve for feeding, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours just watching his son sleep. Maeve fell in love with her husband all over again, seeing this new tender side of him. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and louder than before but richer for it. The ranch continued to prosper, and Quincy was able to hire a couple of ranch hands to help with the work, which gave him more time to spend with his family. Maeve's garden expanded, and she began preserving and canning food in earnest, filling the cellar with provisions for the winter. As Matthew grew from infant to toddler, Maeve found herself pregnant again. This time a daughter arrived, and they named her Clara after Quincy's mother. 2 years later, another son, Samuel. The house that had once seemed spacious now rang with children's laughter and occasional tears, and both Maeve and Quincy agreed they had never been happier. The years passed in a succession of seasons, each bringing its own challenges and joys. There were drought years when they worried about the cattle and pinched pennies. There were good years when the rains came, and the grass grew tall, and the calves were strong. Through it all, Maeve and Quincy faced everything together, their partnership as strong as ever, their love deepening with time. Maeve sometimes thought back to that desperate girl who had stood alone at the altar, abandoned and terrified. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life. She had become a woman who knew her own strength, who had built a home and a family from nothing, who had found love in the most unexpected place. When their children asked about how their parents met, Maeve and Quincy would exchange amused glances before telling the story. It became a family legend, the tale of the mail-order bride who was jilted and the cowboy who married her before sunset. The children never tired of hearing it, and each time it was told, Maeve appreciated anew the chain of unlikely events that had brought her to this life. One evening when Matthew was 10, Clara 8, and Samuel 6, the family sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The children were playing a game in the yard, their shouts of laughter carrying on the warm air. Quincy sat in his rocking chair with his arm around Maeve, who leaned against his shoulder. "You remember what I said the day we got married?" Quincy asked. "About expecting companionship and partnership but not love." "I remember," Maeve said. "I was such a fool," he said with a laugh. "I had no idea what I was getting into." Neither did I, Maeve admitted. I thought I was settling for survival. Instead, I got everything. We both did, Quincy said, kissing the top of her head. Best decision I ever made walking into that church. Best thing Gerald Patterson ever did was not show up, Maeve said, echoing their old joke. To Gerald Patterson, Quincy said, raising an imaginary glass. The man whose loss was my gain. Maeve laughed and settled more comfortably against her husband's shoulder. The children's laughter continued to fill the air, the cattle lowed in the distance, and the desert stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. She had everything she had ever wanted and so much more she had not known to dream of. The ranch continued to grow over the years. When Matthew turned 16, he began taking on more responsibility, showing a natural aptitude for ranching that made Quincy's chest swell with pride. Clara proved to have Maeve's head for numbers and took over more of the bookkeeping. Samuel, the youngest, was the dreamer of the family, more interested in drawing and music than cattle, and both Maeve and Quincy supported his interests wholeheartedly. By the time Maeve and Quincy celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary, they had added 2 more children to their brood, another daughter and another son, and the ranch had tripled in size. They had built a new, larger house to accommodate the growing family, though they kept the original homestead intact as a kind of monument to their beginnings. The anniversary celebration was a grand affair, with neighbors and friends from all over the territory coming to help them celebrate. The minister who had married them, now quite elderly, attended and gave a speech about how he had thought their hasty marriage was a mistake, but was delighted to have been proven wrong. 20 years ago, I married 2 strangers to each other, he said to the assembled guests. Today I look at them and see 2 people who were clearly meant to find each other, even if they took an unusual path to get there. Their marriage has been a testament to the power of commitment, kindness, and love. Maeve and Quincy danced together to fiddle music, moving with the ease of 2 people who knew each other completely. Their children watched with smiles, and their grandchildren, Matthew and Clara both being married by now, ran around their feet. Can you believe it has been 20 years? Maeve asked as they swayed together. Some days it feels like yesterday, Quincy said. Other days it feels like we have been together forever. Both are true, Maeve said. Any regrets? He asked, though the smile on his face suggested he knew the answer. Not a single one, she said firmly. You? Only that I did not walk into that church an hour earlier, he said, could have saved you some of that pain. The pain made the joy sweeter, Maeve said. I appreciate what we have because I know what it is like to have nothing. As the party continued around them, Maeve reflected on the improbable journey that had brought her here. From a mill worker in Boston to a jilted bride to a rancher's wife and mother of 6, her life had been transformed in ways she could never have predicted. The fear and desperation that had driven her west seemed like artifacts from another person's life. She had learned that home was not a place, but the people you loved. She had learned that family was not always the one you were born into, but sometimes the one you built with your own hands. She had learned that love could grow from the smallest seeds if you tended it with care and patience. Looking at Quincy, his face lined now with age and sun, but still dear to her, she felt overwhelming gratitude. He had seen her at her lowest point and offered her not pity but partnership. He had promised her honesty and delivered love. He had given her not just survival but a life rich with meaning and joy. "What are you thinking?" he asked, noticing her expression. "That I am the luckiest woman in Arizona territory," she said. "That is funny," he said with a grin. "I was just thinking I am the luckiest man." Their children came to pull them back into the celebration, and they allowed themselves to be swept up in the music and laughter and love that filled the evening. The desert stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had watched over them for 20 years and would continue to watch over them for all the years to come. Time continued its steady march, and Maeve and Quincy grew old together, their love never wavering even as their hair grayed and their steps slowed. The ranch was eventually turned over to Matthew, who ran it with the same dedication his father had shown. Clara opened a school in Vulture City, teaching children their letters and numbers. Samuel became a successful artist, his paintings of the Arizona landscape hanging in galleries across the country. The younger children found their own paths, all of them carrying with them the lessons their parents had taught them about hard work, honesty, and love. On their 50th wedding anniversary, Maeve and Quincy sat on the porch of the old homestead, now surrounded by the much larger ranch compound. They were in their 70s now, both still remarkably healthy but feeling the weight of their years. Their children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren had come to celebrate, filling the property with noise and life. 50 years, Maeve marveled. Half a century. Best 50 years of my life, Quincy said, his voice still strong despite his age. Mine too, Maeve agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their descendants celebrate. Maeve's mind drifted back to that girl in the borrowed wedding dress, alone at the altar. If she could speak to that girl now, what would she say? That everything would work out, that she would find love and happiness, that the abandonment that felt like the end was actually a beginning. All of that was true, but it was not quite enough. She would tell that girl to be brave, to take chances, to trust that even in the darkest moments, hope could still bloom. She would tell her that sometimes the life you end up with is better than the one you planned. She would tell her that love is not always lightning strikes and fireworks. Sometimes it is quiet mornings and shared laughter and a hand to hold when things get hard. "What are you thinking about?" Quincy asked, reading her expression as easily as he always had. "That girl I used to be," Maeve said, "the one who came west looking for security and found so much more." "I am glad she came," Quincy said. "I am glad she was brave enough to marry a stranger." "I am glad you were reckless enough to propose to one," Maeve countered. He laughed. "We were quite a pair, were we not? Still are." "Always will be," Maeve said, taking his hand. As the sun set on their 50th anniversary, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors it had on so many evenings before, Maeve felt a deep sense of peace. Her life had not been easy, but it had been good. She had loved and been loved. She had raised children who were kind and capable. She had built something lasting with a man who had proven, day after day, year after year, that he was worthy of her trust. The story that had begun with abandonment and desperation had become a love story for the ages, proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. She had come to Vulture City, Arizona territory, as Maeve Fitzgerald, alone and afraid. She was leaving this life as Maeve York, surrounded by love, having lived a life richer than any she could have imagined. Years later, when Maeve passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, Quincy grieved deeply, but took comfort in knowing they had had 53 years together. He followed her just 6 months later, his children claiming he had died of a broken heart, unable to face life without his beloved wife. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the vast Arizona sky they had both loved. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names and the dates of their births and deaths, but at the bottom, their children had added one line: "Together from the beginning, together for eternity." The ranch continued for generations, always staying in the York family, and the story of Maeve and Quincy was passed down as a family treasure. It became a reminder that love can bloom in the most unlikely soil, that commitment and kindness can transform strangers into soulmates, and that sometimes being abandoned at the altar by one man is simply fate's way of leading you to the right one. In the years that followed, their descendants would visit that hillside grave and think about the great-great-grandparents they had never met, but whose love had made their own lives possible. They would imagine that desperate woman in a borrowed wedding dress, and that cowboy who walked through a church door with an outrageous proposal, and they would marvel at the courage it took to build a life together from such an uncertain beginning. The house Maeve had made into a home eventually became a museum of sorts, preserved by the family as a testament to their legacy. Visitors could see her kitchen where she had prepared thousands of meals, the nursery where she had rocked her babies, the porch where she and Quincy had spent countless evenings watching the sunset. They could read her journals, careful accounts of daily life that revealed not just the facts of existence, but the depth of feeling that had animated it. In one entry from their 5th anniversary, she had written, "Today Quincy brought me wildflowers, the same kind I carried at our wedding. He said he passes that patch every day on his way to check the south fence and always thinks of me. Such small gestures mean so much. I think of the life I almost had with Gerald Patterson and I shudder. That would have been a life of obligation and duty. This is a life of love. I thank God every day for bringing Quincy into that church." And in Quincy's papers, found after his death, was a letter he had never sent, written shortly after they married. "Dear Maeve, I know you sleep just in the next room, but I find myself wanting to write this down so you might read it someday when I am gone. Marrying you was the most impulsive thing I ever did, but also the smartest. You have brought light into a house that was dark, warmth into a life that was cold. I promise to spend the rest of my days making sure you never regret saying yes to a stranger in a dusty church. You are my whole heart. Quincy." These documents, these small pieces of evidence of a great love, became treasured artifacts. They reminded generations that followed that love was not always neat or convenient, that sometimes it required leaps of faith, that it could be found in the most unexpected circumstances if you were brave enough to reach for it. The town of Vulture City grew and changed over the decades, but the story of Maeve and Quincy remained a favorite local legend. The church where they had married was eventually torn down, but a plaque was erected on the site commemorating the unusual wedding that had taken place there in 1882. Tourists would visit and take pictures, and locals would tell the story to anyone who would listen. Young couples in particular seemed drawn to the tale. Those who were facing their own doubts and uncertainties would hear about a woman who had been abandoned and a man who had offered her salvation, and how that unpromising beginning had blossomed into a love story that lasted a lifetime. They would take hope from it, believing that if love could grow from such rocky soil, perhaps their own relationships could weather whatever storms came their way. The land itself seemed to remember them. The hill where they were buried became a place of pilgrimage for romantics, and it was said that if you visited at sunset, you could almost feel their presence in the warm desert wind. Whether that was true, or simply the power of story working on imagination, did not really matter. What mattered was that their love had left an imprint, not just on their descendants but on the land and the community they had been part of. As years turned into decades and decades into a century, the details might have blurred slightly in the retelling. Some versions of the story had Quincy bursting into the church on horseback. Others had Maeve fainting at the altar before he arrived. But the core of the story remained true. A desperate woman, an honorable man, and a hastily spoken vow that became the foundation of an extraordinary love. Scholars who studied the settlement of the American West sometimes reference their story as an example of the unconventional social arrangements that characterized frontier life. Feminists pointed to Maeve's journey as evidence of the limited options available to women and her resourcefulness in making the best of a bad situation. Romantics simply saw it as proof that true love exists. But perhaps the truest legacy of Maeve and Quincy was not in the historical record, or the family stories, or even in the physical artifacts they left behind. It was in the lessons their life together taught. That kindness matters, that commitment is a choice you make every day, that love grows through shared work and mutual respect, that being vulnerable enough to accept help is its own kind of courage, and that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing in disguise. Their great-great-grandchildren, sitting around dinner tables in the 21st century, would tell their children about the ancestors who had married as strangers and died as soulmates. They would point out that, in an age of easy divorce and disposable relationships, Maeve and Quincy had shown what was possible when two people committed to each other fully and worked every day to honor that commitment. The ranch itself, still operating after more than a century, stood as a monument to what they had built together. Every fence post Quincy had set, every vegetable Maeve had planted, every decision they had made together had contributed to something that outlasted them both. It was a legacy not just of land and livestock, but of love made tangible. And so the story lived on, passed from generation to generation, a tale of hope and courage and the transformative power of love. It reminded people that happy endings are possible, that good men still exist, that women are stronger than they know, and that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see your worth and offer you a chance. The sun that had set on Maeve and Quincy's wedding day rose and set thousands of times on the life they built together, and each sunrise brought new reasons to be grateful for that improbable beginning. In the end, their story was simple. Two lonely people found each other and chose every day to build a life together. And from that simple choice came a love that echoed through generations, proving that the best love stories are not about perfect beginnings, but about two imperfect people who refuse to give up on each other. As the years continued to pass, and the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the York family ranch adapted to modern times while still honoring its history. The descendants of Maeve and Quincy made sure that their story was never forgotten, incorporating it into the ranch's identity, and even offering tours that included the preserved homestead where it all began. And every year on that spring day in April, the family gathered at the gravesite on the hill to celebrate the anniversary of that strange, wonderful wedding. They would bring flowers, the same desert wildflowers that Maeve had carried, and they would tell the story one more time, keeping the memory alive for another generation. The story of the mail-order bride who was abandoned at the altar, and the cowboy who married her before sunset, had become more than just family history. It had become a reminder that love can bloom anywhere, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the words, "I do," spoken to a stranger who becomes your everything. And as the sun set over the Arizona desert each evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and pink, it was easy to imagine Maeve and Quincy somewhere beyond, still together, still in love, their story complete but their legacy continuing forever in the land they loved and the family they created, and the lesson they taught about the enduring power of commitment, kindness, and love.